In the year 410, the city of Rome was sacked for the first time in 800 years. People who grew up thinking their empire would last forever watched it fall in a matter of days. Centuries later, in the jungles of Central America, the great Maya cities went silent. Temples that had stood for generations were swallowed by trees. By around 900 CE, the heart of their civilization was gone on a tiny island in the Pacific. A society that once moved 100-ton stone statues across miles of land collapsed so completely that when Europeans arrived, the survivors couldn't explain how their ancestors had done it. These weren't movie plots. They were real places, real people, real collapses. And here's the part that should make us uncomfortable. Every one of those civilizations thought they were permanent. Everyone had governments, trade, and technology that seemed solid. Everyone had warning signs they either missed or chose to ignore.
Doom scrolling and brain rot.
Save our future!
Today, our global civilization has its own warning signs. We're recording environmental stress levels humans have never seen before. Trust in politics is collapsing in major democracies. Economic inequality is stretching to extremes that once came before revolutions. People feel more divided and more alone, even as we're more connected than any society in history. And that connection is a new problem. When Rome fell, China kept going. When the Maya cities emptied out, Europe barely noticed. When one region collapsed, others went on. Today, our systems are tied together. If one major part fails, the shock can jump borders in seconds. So the question isn't, could society collapse? History already answered that. It can, and it has, many times. The real question is whether the warning signs we're seeing now match the patterns that came before past collapses, or whether modern society has something those other civilizations never had. Something that makes us different, maybe even something that makes us safer. But before we can answer whether we're approaching collapse, we need to know what collapse actually means. Because that word gets thrown around constantly, and almost always incorrectly. When a stock market crashes, headlines scream collapse. When a government loses an election, commentators declare collapse. When a celebrity's career implodes, the internet announces collapse. But actual societal collapse is something entirely different, and if we can't define it properly, we can't assess whether it's happening. Anthropologist Joseph Tainter spent decades studying fallen civilizations and came up with the most widely accepted definition. Collapse, he argued, is a rapid, significant loss of an established level of socio-political complexity. Not a temporary crisis. Not a recession, not even a war. Collapse is when the intricate systems that hold a society together, the institutions, the infrastructure, the shared understanding of how things work, all of that breaks down faster than it can be rebuilt. In practical terms, historians look for specific markers: the disappearance of central government, a dramatic drop in population, the abandonment of cities, the breakdown of trade networks, the loss of specialized knowledge and skills. When literacy rates plummet because there's no longer a system to teach reading, that's collapse. When coins stop being minted because there's no authority to guarantee their value, that's collapse. When roads fall into disrepair because there's no one to maintain them, that's collapse. But here's where it gets complicated. Scholars argue endlessly about where to draw the line between collapse and mere transformation. The fall of the Western Roman Empire looks like textbook collapse. Central authority vanished, cities shrank, trade routes dissolved, literacy plummeted. But the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years. Roman law influenced every legal system that followed. Latin evolved into the all Romance languages. Christianity, born in the Roman world, became the dominant religion of Europe. So did Rome collapse, or did it transform? Some historians say both. That collapse isn't a binary state, it's a spectrum. A society can lose its political structure but retain its cultural DNA. It can fracture regionally while pieces continue elsewhere. It can decline over centuries, or crumble in decades. This ambiguity matters because it shapes how we interpret modern stress signals. If we define collapse too narrowly as total civilizational extinction, then obviously we're not on the brink. Humans aren't going extinct. But if we define it more accurately as a rapid loss of complexity, as systems breaking down faster than they can be repaired, then the question becomes far more urgent. Therefore, to assess whether modern society is approaching collapse, we need to understand how collapse has actually happened in history. Not the Hollywood version, not the mythology. The real patterns, the real causes, the real warning signs. And when we look at past collapses, three patterns emerge again and again. First, collapse is almost never caused by a single factor. Second, it usually has a long buildup but a fast tipping point. And third, it's almost never total. It's regional, uneven, and leaves survivors who adapt. Let's start with Rome. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is the collapse everyone thinks they understand. Barbarians invaded, Rome burned, the Dark Ages began. Simple story, except it's almost entirely wrong. Rome didn't fall in a day. It didn't even fall in a century. The process took roughly 300 years of compounding stress. In the 2nd century, Rome was the most powerful state on earth. It controlled the entire Mediterranean. Its armies were unmatched. Its cities were marvels of engineering. Its economy supported millions. But by the 3rd century, cracks were appearing. Plague swept through the empire multiple times, killing perhaps a third of the population. That meant fewer farmers, fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers. The government responded by debasing the currency, mixing cheap metals into coins to stretch resources. That caused inflation. Inflation caused economic chaos. Chaos caused more instability. Meanwhile, Rome's borders were under constant pressure, not from a single massive invasion, but from a slow, grinding migration of peoples fleeing their own collapses further east. Rome's solution was to hire some of these migrants as soldiers, but that meant the army was now full of men with no loyalty to Roman culture or institutions. Civil wars became routine as generals fought for power. At one point in the 3rd century, the empire splintered into 3 separate states, each claiming to be the true Rome. By the 4th century, the capital had moved from Rome to Constantinople. The western and eastern halves were barely communicating. In 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome itself. The city that hadn't fallen to a foreign army in 8 centuries was plundered. But even then, the empire didn't completely collapse. It limped along. In 476, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. That's the date historians use for the fall. But it wasn't a dramatic ending. It was an exhausted system finally giving up. Here's the key insight. Rome didn't collapse because barbarians were uniquely fierce. They'd been on the borders for centuries. Rome collapsed because the internal systems that once absorbed shocks, the tax base, the legions, the bureaucracy, the shared belief in Roman superiority, all of those had degraded to the point where they couldn't respond anymore. Complexity costs energy. When Rome could no longer afford the energy to maintain its complexity, the system simplified. Cities shrank. Trade localized. Central authority fractured into feudal kingdoms. It wasn't the end of humanity in Europe. It was the end of a particular way of organizing society. But Rome's collapse was slow and partial. The Maya. Collapse shows a different pattern. For over 1,000 years, the Maya built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. They developed advanced mathematics, including the concept of zero. They created a writing system. They built massive stone cities in the jungle with pyramids, palaces, and astronomical observatories. By 800 CE, cities like Tikal held tens of thousands of people. They had complex irrigation systems, trade routes stretching hundreds of miles, and a sophisticated political hierarchy. And then, within about a century, it all stopped. Cities were abandoned, construction ceased, population plummeted. When Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, the jungle had swallowed the ruins. For decades, archaeologists debated what happened. Some theories blamed conquest, others blamed disease. But the evidence increasingly points to environmental collapse combined with political fragmentation. The Maya had pushed their agricultural system to the limit. They'd cleared forests for farmland and fuel. They'd built cities in areas dependent on seasonal rainfall. And then, around 800 CE, a series of severe droughts struck. Not a single bad year, but decades of reduced rainfall. In a society dependent on maize agriculture, that was catastrophic. But here's what makes the Maya collapse fascinating. It wasn't universal. Coastal Maya cities continued. Northern Maya regions adapted. Some populations migrated. Others shifted to different crops. The collapse was concentrated in the southern lowlands, where cities like Tikal and Palenque fell silent. This tells us something critical. Even in what we call a collapse, resilience and adaptation were happening. Some groups found ways to survive. Some regions continued. Collapse, in other words, was a localized systems failure, not a species-wide extinction event. It was the end of a specific configuration of power and complexity, not the end of Maya people or culture. Therefore, when we hear about Easter Island, we're primed to expect ecocide. For years, the story was simple and terrifying. The islanders cut down all their trees to move the giant moai statues. Without trees, they couldn't build boats to fish or leave. Without boats or trees, food became scarce. Society descended into warfare and cannibalism. The population crashed from 15,000 to just a few thousand. It was the ultimate cautionary tale, a civilization that destroyed its own environment and paid the ultimate price. But recent archaeology has complicated that story dramatically. New evidence suggests the population never reached 15,000. It was probably closer to 3,000 at its peak. The collapse wasn't as sudden or complete as once believed. And the islanders didn't just passively destroy their environment. They adapted. When they ran low on trees, they built stone-walled gardens to protect crops from wind. They shifted to more intensive agriculture. They developed techniques to survive with limited resources. The real crisis on Easter Island likely came not from environmental mismanagement alone, but from a combination of factors including drought, soil depletion, and the introduction of rats by Polynesian settlers, which devoured palm seeds and prevented forest regeneration. And the final blow came from outside. European contact brought diseases that devastated the population. Peruvian slavers kidnapped many of the survivors in the 1860s. By the time archaeologists arrived, the remaining islanders couldn't explain their own history because the knowledge keepers were gone. So the Easter Island collapse teaches us something crucial. The popular narrative of collapse is often wrong. What looks like ecocide might be a society adapting under stress until an external shock finished them off. What looks like a cautionary tale about environmental destruction might actually be a story about resilience under impossible conditions. History is more complicated than we want it to be. And that complication matters because if we misread the past, we'll misread the present. But even with that complexity, certain patterns emerge. Across Rome, the Maya, Easter Island, and dozens of other case studies, collapse follows a recognizable shape. It starts with stress on critical systems: food, water, energy, political legitimacy. Early on, societies absorb those stresses. They innovate, they adapt, they reallocate resources. But adaptation costs energy, and if the stress continues, the cost of maintaining complexity eventually exceeds the benefits. That's when systems start to simplify. Trade contracts, specialization decreases, central authority weakens. For a while, this simplification can be managed. But if multiple systems fail simultaneously, if drought combines with political crisis, combines with external pressure, that's when you hit a tipping point. The society doesn't slowly decline. It rapidly loses complexity. What took centuries to build unravels in decades. And critically, it almost never happens everywhere at once. Collapse is geographically uneven. Some regions fall apart while others continue. Some groups suffer catastrophically while others adapt. The survivors aren't starting from zero. They carry knowledge, culture, and social structures forward. They rebuild, but often in a simpler form. Therefore, if we want to know whether modern society is approaching collapse, we need to ask whether we're seeing the same stress patterns. Are critical systems under pressure? Are adaptation costs rising? Are we approaching the point where complexity becomes too expensive to maintain? And if so, are we seeing it in the same domains where past collapses began? Let's start with the environmental domain, because resource stress is the most common collapse trigger in history. And the data here is unambiguous. Human activity is pushing Earth systems harder than at any point in recorded history. Global carbon dioxide levels are higher than they've been in 3 million years. The last decade included the hottest years ever measured. Arctic sea ice is disappearing at rates that shocked even pessimistic climate models. Ocean acidification is accelerating. Coral reefs, which support a quarter of all marine species, are collapsing. Roughly 44% of coral species are now threatened with extinction. On land, biodiversity is in freefall. Wildlife populations have declined by an average of 69% since 1970. 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Insect populations, which are critical for pollination and food chains, are plummeting in many regions. Forests are being cleared at alarming rates. The Amazon rainforest, which generates much of its own rainfall, is approaching a tipping point where it could shift from rainforest to savanna. If that happens, it's irreversible on human timescales. And here's what makes this terrifying from a collapse perspective. These aren't isolated problems. They're interconnected. Climate change drives biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss weakens ecosystems. Weak ecosystems are less able to absorb carbon or regulate climate. It's a feedback loop, and feedback loops are exactly what collapse researchers worry about. Because once you trigger a cascade, stopping it becomes exponentially harder. 20% of countries are now considered at high risk of ecosystem collapse. That doesn't mean those countries will disappear. It means their natural systems, the forests, rivers, soil, rainfall patterns that support agriculture and water and stability, could cross thresholds and fail to recover. But environmental stress alone rarely causes collapse. It has to combine with other pressures. Therefore, we need to look at the economic domain. And here, the picture is equally concerning. Inequality within nations is approaching extremes not seen since the Gilded Age or the years before the French Revolution. In the United States, the wealthiest 1% now own more wealth than the entire middle class. In many developed countries, younger generations are the first in modern history expected to be poorer than their parents. Wages have stagnated for decades, even as productivity soared. The gains from economic growth have concentrated at the very top. Meanwhile, global debt has reached historic levels. Total world debt is now around 235% of global GDP. Governments are stretched. Corporations are overleveraged. Households are drowning in obligations. This matters because debt is a claim on future resources. It assumes growth will continue. It assumes tomorrow's economy will be larger than today's. But if growth stalls, if resources become scarce, if systems break down, debt becomes unpayable. And unpayable debt triggers cascades. Banks fail, governments default, currency collapses, trade halts. We saw a preview during the 2008 financial crisis. The failure of a few investment banks nearly brought down the entire global financial system. Only massive government intervention prevented a full meltdown. But that intervention came at a cost. Governments took on enormous debt. Central banks printed trillions in new money. Those measures stabilized the immediate crisis, but created fragility elsewhere. We're now in a situation where any major shock, a pandemic, a war, a crop failure, could trigger another financial cascade. And unlike 2008, governments may not have the capacity to intervene again. Youth unemployment is another warning sign. In 2023, roughly 65 million young people aged 15 to 24 were jobless worldwide. That's about 13% of that age group. In some regions, it's much higher. Spain and Greece saw youth unemployment above 30% after the 2008 crisis. Young people without economic prospects don't just suffer individually. They lose faith in systems. They become susceptible to radical politics. They stop forming families. They stop investing in the future. That creates demographic collapse, which creates economic collapse, which creates political collapse. Again, feedback loops. Therefore, we have to examine the political domain. Because environmental and economic stress don't directly cause collapse. They cause collapse when institutions fail to respond. And institutional failure is exactly what we're seeing. Trust in government is near historic lows in many democracies. In the United States, only about 20% of citizens say they trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. In the 1960s, that number was above 70%. Similar declines are visible across Europe. People don't believe their leaders are competent, honest, or even care about their problems. The Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index hit a new low in 2023. The number of full democracies is shrinking. Authoritarian regimes are growing bolder. Even in stable democracies, polarization is tearing societies apart. In the United States, Republicans and Democrats increasingly don't just disagree on policy. They view each other as existential threats. They live in separate information ecosystems. They don't share a common understanding of basic facts. This isn't just partisan bickering. It's the erosion of the shared reality necessary for collective action. And collective action is exactly what you need to avoid collapse. When drought struck the Maya, they needed coordinated responses. When plague hit Rome, they needed functional government. When modern societies face climate change, pandemics, economic shocks, they need institutions capable of making hard decisions and mobilizing resources. But if half the population doesn't trust the government, doesn't believe experts, doesn't even agree that problems exist, then collective action becomes impossible. Geopolitical tensions add another layer of instability. The war in Ukraine, escalating conflict in the Middle East, U.S.-China rivalry. These aren't just regional problems. They disrupt supply chains, they threaten nuclear escalation, they drain resources into military spending that could go toward adaptation. When past empires faced external threats, they often pulled together. But that only works if there's internal cohesion. If your society is already fractured, external pressure accelerates collapse rather than preventing it. But political fragmentation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's driven by deeper social breakdown. Therefore, we need to look at social cohesion. And this is where some of the most disturbing trends emerge. Loneliness is now considered a public health crisis in multiple countries. Social trust, the basic belief that most people are generally trustworthy, has declined steeply. Surveys show people are less likely to help strangers, less likely to join community organizations, less likely to know their neighbors. Mental health issues, particularly among young people, have skyrocketed. Anxiety, depression, and suicide rates are rising. In the United States, life expectancy actually declined for several years, driven largely by what researchers call deaths of despair. Suicides, overdoses, alcoholism. These aren't random individual tragedies. They're symptoms of systemic social dysfunction. Past collapses were often preceded by social disintegration. As Maya cities competed for dwindling resources, warfare increased. As Rome's economy failed, banditry surged, and trust collapsed. Social breakdown creates a vicious cycle. When people don't trust each other, they don't cooperate. When they don't cooperate, they can't solve collective problems. When they can't solve problems, stress increases. Stress increases fear. Fear increases tribalism. Tribalism destroys trust, and around it goes. What makes modern social breakdown unique is its speed and scale. Social media amplifies outrage and division. Algorithms reward extreme content. Filter bubbles isolate people in echo chambers. Misinformation spreads faster than truth. Foreign actors deliberately sow discord. The result is societies that are physically connected but psychologically fragmented. Everyone is online, but no one trusts anyone. Therefore, technology isn't just a neutral tool. It's an amplifier of both resilience and fragility, which brings us to the technological domain. On one hand, modern technology gives us capabilities no past civilization possessed. We can monitor global systems in real time. We can predict hurricanes and droughts. We can communicate instantly across continents. We have renewable energy technologies that could replace fossil fuels. We have the knowledge to feed billions sustainably if we chose to implement it. But on the other hand, our technology creates new forms of fragility. Our entire civilization runs on electrical grids. If those grids fail, food distribution stops, water treatment stops, hospitals stop, communication stops. Everything stops within days. And grids are vulnerable. Cyber attacks on infrastructure are increasing. State actors have demonstrated the ability to shut down power systems remotely. Criminal groups have ransomed hospitals and pipelines. A coordinated attack on critical infrastructure could cause cascading failures across interconnected systems. Artificial intelligence is another wild card. In the near term, AI-generated misinformation is already a recognized threat. The World Economic Forum listed it as a top global risk. AI can create fake videos, fake audio, fake news articles that are nearly impossible to distinguish from reality. In a world where people already don't agree on basic facts, AI-powered deception could shatter shared reality entirely. In the longer term, automation driven by AI could displace enormous numbers of workers. If that happens faster than societies can adapt, you get mass unemployment, social unrest, and political instability. Again, not a single failure, but a cascade. And, perhaps most troubling, our technological complexity itself is a vulnerability. Every system depends on other systems. Your phone depends on rare earth minerals mined in specific countries, manufactured in other countries, assembled in still others, running on software written by thousands of programmers, communicating through infrastructure maintained by utilities, powered by grids that depend on fuel supplies. If any critical node in that chain breaks, the whole thing can fail. Nassim Taleb calls this systemic fragility. The more interconnected and complex a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to cascading failures. A drought in one region can trigger food shortages elsewhere. A pandemic can shut down global supply chains. A war can spike energy prices worldwide. One bank's failure can threaten the entire financial system. But here's the paradox. That same interconnection can also be a source of resilience. Information spreads instantly. Resources can be redirected quickly. Innovations diffuse across borders. International cooperation can mobilize responses that no single nation could achieve. So the question isn't whether technology makes us fragile or resilient. It's both. It depends on how we use it. And that's the critical insight. None of these indicators individually guarantees collapse. But together, they form compound stress. And compound stress is exactly what preceded historical collapses. The Maya didn't collapse because of drought alone, but because drought combined with political fragmentation, warfare, and ecological degradation. Rome didn't fall to barbarians alone, but to barbarians plus plague, plus economic crisis, plus political decay, plus overextension. When problems compound, they overwhelm the systems designed to handle them individually. Therefore, the question we have to ask is whether modern society is experiencing compound stress at levels comparable to pre-collapse societies. And if we're being honest, the answer is yes, we are. But that doesn't mean collapse is inevitable. Because there's a crucial difference between modern civilization and every past civilization that collapsed. We know collapse is possible. We've studied it. We understand the patterns. We have tools and knowledge no past society possessed. The Maya didn't have climate science. Rome didn't have global communication. Easter Island didn't have international cooperation frameworks. We do, which means the real question isn't whether we're seeing collapse indicators. We are. The real question is whether we'll respond in time. And that's where expert opinion diverges dramatically. Some researchers look at the data and conclude collapse is not only possible but likely. They argue we're following the exact trajectory of past collapses, but on a global scale. They point to models like limits to growth, which in 1972 predicted that business-as-usual trends would lead to collapse by the mid-21st century. When those models are updated with current data, they show we're still tracking the collapse scenario. They emphasize that Earth systems have tipping points. Once you push past certain thresholds, feedback loops kick in, and the system reorganizes into a new, often less hospitable state. The Amazon becomes savanna. Ice sheets disintegrate. Ocean currents shift. And because these systems are interconnected, triggering one tipping point could trigger others. A domino effect. These researchers argue that we're running out of time, that the window for preventing catastrophic outcomes is closing, that without immediate, drastic action, collapse within this century is probable. But other experts take a more measured view. They acknowledge the stresses are real, but emphasize human adaptability and the possibility of transformation without total collapse. They point to the fact that awareness of these problems is higher than ever. Climate change is no longer a fringe issue. It's discussed by governments, corporations, and citizens worldwide. Renewable energy is becoming cheaper than fossil fuels in many markets. Electric vehicles are scaling rapidly. Carbon capture technologies are advancing. International agreements like the Paris Climate Accord, however imperfect, show that global cooperation is possible. These researchers argue that we're in a race between breakdown and breakthrough. Yes, systems are stressed. Yes, time is short. But humanity has solved seemingly impossible problems before. We've eradicated diseases. We've banned ozone-depleting chemicals, and the ozone layer is recovering. We've reduced extreme poverty dramatically. If we can marshal the same level of innovation and cooperation for climate and inequality and institutional reform, transformation without collapse is achievable. Therefore, there's a third camp, the skeptics. These researchers argue that collapse narratives are overblown and often misunderstand history. They point out that many predicted collapses never happened. Paul Ehrlich predicted mass starvation in the 1970s. It didn't occur. Y2K was supposed to crash computer systems globally. It didn't. Malthusian predictions of resource exhaustion have been wrong repeatedly because they underestimate human ingenuity. Skeptics emphasize that modern societies are far more resilient than ancient ones. We have diversified energy sources. We have global trade that can redistribute resources. We have scientific knowledge that lets us predict and prepare for shocks. We have institutions, however flawed, that can coordinate responses. They argue that what looks like pre-collapse stress is actually just normal turbulence. Societies always face challenges. Recessions happen. Political tensions flare. Environmental problems arise. But modern civilization is robust. We'll adapt, as we always have. But here's the problem with all three views. They're working with incomplete information. The future hasn't happened yet. We don't know which scenario will unfold. And that uncertainty itself is part of the challenge. Because if collapse is coming and we assume it isn't, we fail to prepare and make it inevitable. But if collapse isn't inevitable, and we panic, we could trigger instability through overreaction. So how do we assess signal versus noise? How do we tell the difference between genuine early warning signs and normal fluctuations? Therefore, researchers have developed frameworks for distinguishing structural problems from temporary shocks. A key insight is that collapse rarely happens from a single event. Civilizations can absorb individual shocks. Rome survived multiple plagues before it fell. The Maya weathered droughts before the final series broke them. What matters is cumulative stress. If systems are already stretched, a shock that would normally be manageable becomes catastrophic. Think of it like a bridge. A well-maintained bridge can handle heavy loads. But if the bridge has been neglected, if rust has weakened the beams, if cracks have spread through the concrete, then a load that would have been fine 10 years ago causes collapse. The problem isn't the final truck. It's the accumulated degradation that made the bridge fragile. So when we look at modern indicators, we need to ask not just whether we're seeing problems, but whether we're seeing accumulated degradation of critical systems. And in many domains, we are. Environmental resilience is degrading. We've lost half the world's wetlands, which buffer floods and filter water. We've depleted soil health through industrial agriculture. We've overfished oceans to the point where many fisheries are near collapse. These aren't crises yet. They're silent erosion of the systems that absorb shocks. Economic resilience is degrading. Record debt levels mean governments have less capacity to respond to crises. Inequality means large portions of the population have no financial cushion. Supply chain concentration means disruptions have outsized effects. Remember when a single ship got stuck in? The Suez Canal and global trade seized up? That's fragility. Political resilience is degrading. Trust is down. Polarization is up. The ability to make long-term decisions is compromised. Institutions that once commanded respect are now viewed with suspicion. That means when a crisis hits, collective action becomes harder. Social resilience is degrading. Community ties are weaker. Mental health is worse. Shared identity is fracturing. That means populations are less able to endure hardship together. But degraded resilience doesn't mean imminent collapse. It means vulnerability. A society with high resilience can weather a major shock and bounce back. A society with low resilience might collapse from a shock that would have been survivable a generation ago. Therefore, the critical question is what kind of shocks might we face? And here, the range is wide. Climate change will bring more frequent and severe disasters. Heat waves, droughts, floods, hurricanes. Each one strains resources. Each one tests institutions. If they come faster than societies can recover between them, that's when compound stress becomes unbearable. Pandemics are another threat. COVID-19 killed millions and disrupted the global economy for years. And it wasn't even particularly deadly by pandemic standards. A virus with COVID's transmissibility and Ebola's lethality would be civilization-threatening. Geopolitical conflict could escalate. A war between major powers could go nuclear. Even conventional war could disrupt global systems catastrophically. Financial crashes could cascade into depression. Imagine 2008, but without the ability to print money and bail out banks, because governments are already drowning in debt. Cyber warfare could take down critical infrastructure across multiple countries simultaneously. And the nightmare scenario is multiple shocks at once. A pandemic, during a financial crisis, during a climate disaster, during a war. That's what breaks resilience. Because you can't respond to everything simultaneously when you're already stretched thin. Past collapses often followed that pattern. Not a single catastrophe, but a cluster of crises that overwhelmed adaptive capacity. The Maya faced drought, warfare, and political fragmentation at once. Rome faced plague, economic collapse, and barbarian pressure simultaneously. When problems compound, solutions become exponentially harder. But this brings us to the most important question. If modern society is vulnerable, if we're seeing genuine collapse indicators, what futures are actually possible? Because collapse isn't a single outcome. It's a range of scenarios with vastly different implications. And understanding those scenarios is the only way to think clearly about what might happen and what we might do about it. The first scenario is business as usual. We continue current trends. Emissions keep rising. Inequality keeps widening. Trust keeps eroding. In this scenario, we drift toward regional and potentially global collapse over the next few decades. Environmental systems hit tipping points. Economic systems become so unequal they stop functioning. Political systems lose legitimacy entirely. The global order fractures into competing blocks. This scenario mirrors the limits to growth collapse trajectory. Population peaks and then declines sharply. Industrial output crashes. Food production plummets. It's not extinction, but it's a catastrophic simplification. Billions would suffer. Many wouldn't survive. Complex global civilization as we know it would end, replaced by fragmented, localized societies, struggling with degraded environments and lost knowledge. But there's a second scenario, managed descent. In this version, societies recognize the trajectory and choose controlled contraction. Degrowth policies deliberately shrink resource consumption. Economies prioritize well-being over GDP growth. Inequality is reduced through redistribution. International cooperation strengthens to manage shared challenges. This isn't utopian. It's still a decline in material abundance. but it's a decline managed in ways that preserve social cohesion and minimize suffering. Think of it as shrinking the economy to fit within planetary boundaries while maintaining high quality of life through equity and efficiency. Some researchers argue this is the only realistic way to avoid worse outcomes. That continued growth is physically impossible on a finite planet, so the choice is between managed shrinkage and chaotic collapse. The third scenario is patchwork outcomes. Collapse isn't global, it's regional. Some areas face catastrophic breakdowns, failed states, resource wars, mass migration, environmental collapse. But other regions adapt successfully. They invest in resilience. They transition to sustainable systems. They maintain functioning institutions. In this scenario, the world becomes radically unequal, not just in wealth, but in basic survivability. Climate change already affects different regions differently. Some places become uninhabitable. Others become more productive. If adaptive capacity correlates with wealth, which it likely does, then poor regions collapse while rich regions endure. This raises profound ethical questions. Do wealthy nations accept refugees from collapsing regions? Do they share resources and technology? Or do they fortress themselves and let others suffer? And then there's a fourth scenario: transformative resilience. In this version, the crises we're facing trigger not collapse, but a fundamental reorganization of human civilization. The threat becomes so clear that it breaks through political paralysis. Societies invest massively in renewable energy, carbon capture, ecosystem restoration. Economic systems shift from growth to sustainability. Governance becomes more effective through necessity. Technology accelerates solutions, not because of optimism, but because failure is so obviously catastrophic that collective action becomes possible. This scenario isn't about avoiding all hardship. Climate change will still cause suffering. Transitions will still be painful. But civilization emerges from the crisis transformed, not destroyed. More equitable, more sustainable, more resilient. Which of these scenarios unfolds depends entirely on choices made in the next few years. And that's the key insight. Collapse is not a force of nature. It's a failure of adaptation. Past societies collapsed because they couldn't or wouldn't change course in time. They were locked into systems that worked until they didn't. They had cultural beliefs or economic structures or political dynamics that prevented adaptive responses. Modern society has the same problem. We know climate change is happening. We know inequality is destabilizing. We know biodiversity loss is dangerous. But we're locked into systems that perpetuate all of it. Fossil fuel companies fund climate denial. Wealthy elites resist redistribution. Polarized. Populations can't agree on basic facts. Short-term political incentives override long-term survival. Therefore, the question isn't whether collapse is scientifically possible. It obviously is. The question is whether we're politically and culturally capable of the changes necessary to avoid it. And history gives us mixed signals. Sometimes societies do adapt. Sometimes they see the cliff and turn away. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they drive right over the edge, not because they couldn't see it coming, but because changing course required sacrifices no one was willing to make. So where does that leave us? Are we on the brink of collapse? The honest answer is we're in a state of elevated risk. Not inevitable collapse, but not safe either. We're seeing compound stress across multiple domains. We're seeing degraded resilience. We're seeing patterns that have preceded past collapses. But we're also seeing unprecedented adaptive capacity. We have knowledge, tools, and global coordination possibilities that no past civilization possessed. What we're lacking is collective will, the ability to prioritize long-term survival over short-term convenience, the ability to cooperate across borders and ideologies, the ability to make hard choices before catastrophe forces them on us. The civilizations that collapsed didn't do so because they were stupid or primitive. They collapsed because they were trapped by their own success, trapped by systems that worked until they didn't. trapped by the inability to imagine or implement alternatives. We have the advantage of history. We know collapse is possible. We know the warning signs. We know adaptation is possible, but not guaranteed. The question is whether we'll learn from the past or repeat it, whether we'll act while there's still time or wait until it's too late. Because if we wait too long, the choice won't be ours to make. It will be made for us by systems we can no longer control. And when that happens, when complexity collapses faster than we can manage it, the survivors won't be asking whether we saw it coming. They'll be asking why we did nothing when we still could.